In the high valleys of the Wyoming Territory, in the winter of 1868, the wind did not just blow, it searched. It was a living, malicious thing, probing the walls of every cabin, seeking the smallest crack in the chinking, the slightest gap beneath a door. Inside his cabin, perched on the edge of a frozen creek, Elias Thorne listened to that wind. He was a man of 45, broad in the shoulder from the axe, with a quiet intensity in his eyes. He had built this shelter with his own hands, felling the lodgepole pine, notching it tight, mortaring the gaps with clay and lime. By all the standards of the frontier, it was a good, strong cabin, and yet it was failing. The enemy was not the wind itself, but the cold it carried, a cold so profound it felt like a physical weight. In the center of the north-facing gable wall, Elias had built a massive fireplace. It was the pride of the structure, 10 feet wide at its base, built of the best fieldstone he could haul, a monument to the civilizing power of fire. And it was devouring them. A full-grown log, thick as a man's chest, was blazing within its stone mouth. Flames roaring up the flue. The sound was a hollow thunder, and the light it cast was a frantic dancing orange. But the heat was a lie. Elias sat 10 feet away, on a 3-legged stool, and while his face and chest were scorched, his back was rigid with cold. His wife, Sarah, sat closer, wrapped in a trade blanket, her breath pluming in the air, inside their home. "Elias," she said, her voice thin, "the water bucket's frozen solid again, and the potatoes in the sack. They're like rocks." Elias looked. She was right. Not 10 feet from the roaring blaze, a skin of ice had crept over the surface of the water pail. In the far corner, where their 2 children slept under a pile of buffalo robes, the logs of the cabin wall were coated in a delicate, beautiful, and terrifying layer of white frost. The fireplace, the very heart of their survival, was acting like a giant, hungry mouth, sucking every scrap of warmth from the room and vomiting it into the night sky. And in its place, it pulled the Arctic wind through every pore of the cabin. The drafts were not gentle. They were violent, cutting currents of air that snaked across the floor, making the flames dance. Elias knew with a certainty that chilled him more than the air that he was chopping wood all day only to feed a monster that was actively trying to kill him. This way of building, the way everyone built, was wrong. It was fundamentally, fatally wrong. When Elias Thorne had first staked his claim in this valley 3 years prior, he had built just as his father had taught him back in Ohio, and as all his neighbors were building now. The wisdom was simple. A cabin needed a hearth, and a big hearth meant a big fire, and a big fire meant big warmth. It was a sign of prosperity, a bulwark against the wilderness. He had spent the entire first summer hauling the stone, selecting the flattest, densest pieces for the firebox and the back wall. He'd built the chimney tall and wide, believing a strong draft was key to a clean-burning fire. He remembered the pride he felt lighting that first fire, the smoke drawing perfectly, the sense of accomplishment as he and Sarah settled in for their first winter. That pride had lasted less than a month. The reality of a Wyoming winter was not the damp, woody cold of the Ohio Valley. It was a dry, searing, invasive cold that found no purchase in the air, but clung to mass. The fire did not heat the cabin. It created a small, survivable zone directly in front of it. To move outside this 10-foot circle was to enter a different climate. They lived their lives huddled, rotating like spits of meat, cooking their fronts while their backs froze. The labor was unending. The sheer volume of wood the hearth demanded was astronomical. Elias had calculated his winter burn based on his Ohio experience. By January, he saw his woodpile, which should have lasted until the spring melt, reduced by 2/3. A new, desperate kind of labor began, felling trees in the deep snow, his sweat freezing to his clothes, his hands cracking, all to feed the insatiable stone mouth. He tried to fix it. He and Sarah spent days mixing mud and straw, re-chinking every log, stuffing rags under the door, hanging a heavy buffalo hide over the entrance. It did nothing. The problem wasn't the leaks. The problem was the chimney. It was a pump. The column of hot, rising air in the flue created a powerful vacuum that pulled the outside world in. He realized, built a perfect ventilation system designed to replace the air in his cabin with Arctic air every few minutes. He would watch the flames, hypnotized not by their beauty but by their inefficiency, seeing the heat, the physical manifestation of his life's labor, rippling and vanishing upwards into the blackness. He was living in a machine that turned trees into drafts. That spring, after a winter that had left them exhausted and thin, Elias travelled to a trading post down in the flats seeking seed and news. The post was run by a man, but the real centre of the settlement was a small cluster of cabins inhabited by a handful of Scandinavian immigrants, men who had come for the railroad or the mining and stayed for the land. They were seen as quiet, strange, and overly meticulous. Their cabins looked different, smaller, squatter, often with sod roofs. Elias sought out the eldest, a carpenter named Anders Olofsson, a man with a face like carved pine and hands permanently curled around the memory of a tool. Elias, frustrated and tired, explained his problem, describing his massive fireplace and the unbearable cold. Anders listened, nodding slowly, sipping cool coffee from a tin cup. He said little, but eventually gestured to his own cabin. "You come, see." Elias entered. The difference was immediate and baffling. The air inside Anders's small cabin was not hot, it was warm. It was an even, pervasive, gentle warmth that filled the entire space, from the floor to the ceiling, from the door to the far wall. There were no drafts. It was still, comfortable, and quiet. Elias looked for the source. There was no roaring fireplace. Against the central wall, separating the main room from the sleeping nook, stood a giant, smooth, plastered clay and stone structure. It was 8 feet long, 5 feet high, and looked more like a tomb than a hearth. A small cast-iron door was set into its face, warm to the touch, but not hot. A thin metal pipe, no thicker than a man's stovepipe, rose from the top and vented through the roof. There was no fire visible. "Where is your fire, Anders?" Elias asked, confused. Anders tapped the plastered face of the massive structure. "The fire is inside, from this morning. It is gone now." He pointed to the iron door. "We burn fire, fast, 2 hours, very hot, all wood." Then he patted the great stone side of the structure again, a look of deep affection on his face. "The fire is fast, but the stone is slow. The stone holds the heat. Your fireplace," Anders said, making a grand gesture of a wide-open chimney, "it breathes out the heat. It breathes in the cold. It is a hungry ghost. This," he patted the mass again, "this eats the smoke. The smoke walks a long path inside the stone before it leaves. By the time the smoke goes out the roof, it is cold. All the heat is left here in the stone. The stone breathes the heat all day, all night." Elias stood motionless, processing the idea. a fire that was separate from the heat, a chimney that was not a chimney, but a maze. He had been throwing his heat away. He had been building a monument when he should have been building a trap. Elias Thorne returned to his cabin a changed man. He carried the image of Anders Olafsson's stone stove in his mind. He spent the long evenings of that spring not just planning, but rethinking. He sat on his stool, staring at the soot-stained black maw of his failed fireplace, seeing it now for what it was, a wound in his home. He couldn't build Anders' complex plastered Kachelofen. He lacked the iron doors, the precise bricks, the generations of knowledge. But he understood the principle: hold the heat, make the smoke walk. He would use what he had: stone, clay, and his own stubborn labor. His neighbors, Jedediah and Morse, stopped by and saw him sketching on a piece of split cedar with a nub of charcoal. He was drawing a box, a huge, solid box with a winding, snake-like path drawn inside it. "What's that, Elias?" "A map to a treasure?" Jedediah joked. "It's a chimney," Elias said, his voice flat. "That don't look like no chimney. That looks like a rock pile, and you've drawn it in the middle of your cabin." "That's where the heat belongs," Elias said, "not on the wall, leaking into the wind." They left, shaking their heads, whispering that the high country winter had finally cracked him. His plan was radical. He would tear down the north wall chimney, a job that felt both destructive and cleansing. He would use the reclaimed stone and more to build a new mass in the center of his cabin, dividing the main living space from the sleeping quarters. It would be two-sided. On the living side, a small, deep firebox lined with the best soapstone he could find to encourage a hot, fast burn. But the smoke would not go up. It would be forced to go sideways, into a horizontal flue, then up through a second chamber, then sideways, again through a third, before finally venting into a small, safe, clay-lined pipe through the roof. The structure would be enormous, 10 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 6 feet high, a mountain of stone and clay inside his home. It was, by any standard, a ridiculous design. He spent the summer gathering materials. He didn't just need stone, he needed mass. He hauled tons of it from the creek bed, prioritizing heavy, dense, flat stones. He found a vein of pure blue-gray clay and spent weeks digging it, mixing it with sand and cured straw to create a mortar and a plaster that could withstand immense heat without cracking. He was not just building a fireplace, he was building a battery for heat. The first day of demolition was brutal. Tearing down the old chimney felt like admitting a profound failure. The cabin filled with soot, old ash, and the smell of creosote. Sarah and the children stayed outside, watching him swing the sledgehammer, his face masked in black grime. As the monument of his first year's labor came crashing down, he sealed the hole in the gable wall with fresh-cut logs, and the cabin immediately felt darker, smaller, like a sealed box. Then the new work began. He dug a deep, rock-lined foundation inside his cabin floor, terrified that the immense weight of his planned structure would sink and crack. Then he began to lay the stone. It was the slowest, most meticulous work of his life. He built the firebox first, small and deep, like a kiln. Then he began the labyrinth. He laid the capstones for the first horizontal flue, mortaring every joint with his clay sand mix, packing it tight. This was the terror. If the draft failed, if the smoke leaked, the entire contraption would be a useless, toxic monument to his folly. He wasn't just a mason. He was an engineer of air, guessing at fluid dynamics he had no name for. He worked by touch, by feel, by a desperate intuition. The structure rose course by course, a solid, dense and utterly baffling block of stone. He used the heaviest stones for the core and the smoother, flatter stones for the outside. He built a clean-out door for each turn of the flue, a small stone that could be removed to sweep the channels. By late summer it was complete. It stood in the center of his home, a featureless, massive, earthen-plastered cube. It had no mantel, no grand opening, just a small, heavy, iron-plated door he had fashioned for the firebox. Sarah looked at it, her face a mixture of hope and fear. It was, without question, ridiculous. It dominated the room. It was an altar to an idea none of them truly understood. The test came in early November. The air grew still, the sky turned a flat, bruised grey, and the first snow began to fall, not in flakes, but in a dry, sugary dust that signalled the arrival of true, deep cold. The neighbours, hearing that the Thorn Folly was finished, waited. They expected to see Elias, smoke-stained and coughing, begging for help as his cabin filled with smoke, or worse, to see the orange glow of a chimney fire. Elias laid the first fire. He used dry, split aspen, stacking it tight in the small firebox. He lit a twist of resinous pine and pushed it in. He closed the heavy door, and he waited. A thin, acrid tendril of smoke puffed back out of the door's seams. His heart seized. It wasn't drawing. The massive, cold, complex flue was a plug. The smoke had no reason to take that long, difficult path. Sarah's hand went to her mouth. He remembered Anders's words. A cold chimney is a sleeping snake. You must warm its head. He ran to the clean-out door at the very top of the mass, just before the roof pipe, pulled the stone plug, and shoved in a torch of burning pine bark. He held it there, feeding the hot air directly into the final vent, creating an artificial pull. He heard a low, hollow whoosh from deep within the stone. The draft had caught. He sealed the clean-out plug and ran back to the firebox. The smoke was gone. Behind the small iron door, the fire was burning with a terrifying intensity, a jet-white roar he had never seen in his old fireplace. The small firebox was concentrating the heat, and the draft was pulling it clean. He fed it logs for 2 hours, a fraction of his old burn, until the firebox was a bed of white-hot coals. Then he sealed the firebox door and shut the intake damper. The fire died. The cabin was silent. The only sound was the rising wind outside, now a full blizzard. He and Sarah sat in the dim room waiting. An hour passed. The cabin grew colder. Elias felt a crawling despair. It had failed. And then it began. It was not a blast of heat. It was a presence. The surface of the giant plastered block, which had been cold stone, was now warm to the touch. Another hour, and it was hot, a deep penetrating heat you could lean your entire back against. The heat was not scorching. It was a gentle, pervasive radiance. Elias walked to the far corner, the one where the frost had always gathered. The logs were dry. The air was cool, but not cold. He touched the floorboards. They were warm. The entire 10-ton mass of stone and clay was slowly, steadily releasing the heat of that 2-hour fire, radiating it evenly in all directions. The blizzard raged for 3 days. Each morning, Elias would burn a hot, fast fire for 90 minutes. For the rest of the day and night, the massive hearth breathed warmth. The drafts were gone. The cabin was utterly still. His wife, for the first time in winter, took off her heavy shawl. The children played on the floor. Elias Thorne sat on his stool, listening to the wind howl outside, and for the first time since coming to this valley, his home felt truly, profoundly safe. The blizzard broke, leaving a world of blinding white and blue. Jedediah, his face rimmed with ice, floundered through the drifts to check on them, carrying firewood, assuming the worst. He pushed open the door to Elias's cabin, bracing for a wave of smoke or Arctic air. He stopped, confused. The air was warm. It was comfortable. Elias was sitting at the table, mending a harness. Sarah was kneading bread. There was no fire. "In God's name, Elias," Jedediah stammered, looking at the dead, dark iron door on the giant stone box. "Where's your fire? Did it go out?" "Hours ago," Elias said simply. "Touch it." Jedediah put a raw, chapped hand to the plastered clay. He jerked it back, not in pain, but in shock. It was hot. It holds it," he whispered, staring at the structure. "It's a stove made of a mountain." That spring, Jedediah built one, with Elias guiding him. It was rougher, less efficient, but it worked. The next year, 2 more families built them. The Thorn Hearth, as it came to be known, was not beautiful. It was a blunt, massive, practical thing. But its effect was revolutionary. The change was measured in wood piles. By February, the settlers with traditional fireplaces were deep into their emergency reserves, their days consumed by the axe. The families with ridiculous hearths had stacks of wood to spare. The innovation spread, carried by trappers and traders to other valleys. It was adapted. Some built benches into the side, which stayed warm all night, a hot bed. Others built them 2-sided, the firebox opening into the main room, the warm mass heating the sleeping quarters behind it. Decades later, when the railroad brought in cast-iron pot-belly stoves, many settlers modernized. But in the highest, coldest, most wind-scoured valleys, the old-timers and the wisest newcomers knew better. The cast-iron stove was hot, but it was like the old fireplace. It cooled as soon as the fire died. The massive mountain stoves, the legacy of Elias Thorne, were the only things that could truly store a fire, the only things that could hold back the Wyoming night. What Elias Thorne had built, guided by Anders Olafsson's ancestral knowledge, was a masonry heater. He had, without any formal training, mastered the principles of thermal mass and heat exchange. The traditional fireplace was a simple, radiant heater, achieving perhaps 10, maybe 15% efficiency. It was a machine designed to waste energy, throwing 90% of the wood's heat up the chimney, along with the very air it had just warmed. The Thorn Hearth was a different beast entirely. By creating a small, insulated firebox, it encouraged a hot, fast, and remarkably complete combustion, burning the gases and smoke that a traditional chimney would have simply wasted as soot. This was the first stage of its genius. The second was the labyrinth. That long, winding flue was a heat exchanger. As the hot gases, upwards of 1 joule degrees Fahrenheit, were forced to walk that long path, the intense, conductive heat was transferred from the air to the dense mass of the stone. By the time the smoke exited the roof pipe, it was often cool enough to hold a hand over all its useful energy stripped and stored. This stored energy was the third stage. The tons of stone and clay, now charged like a battery, released that heat not as a scorching convective blast, but as gentle, low-temperature, infrared radiation. This radiant heat warmed objects, the floors, the walls, the furniture, the people, creating a stable, bone-deep comfort that no potbelly stove could replicate. Elias Thorne had solved his problem not by adding more fire, but by capturing the fire he already had. He had accidentally engineered a system of high efficiency, clean burning, passive thermal release, centuries after it was perfected in Russia and Scandinavia, and a century before modern building science would give it a name. Elias Thorne lived a long life in that valley. The giant, smooth-faced hearth became the true center of his home, a place of gravity and warmth. In the winter, it was the first thing he touched in the morning and the last thing he touched at night, a solid, dependable promise against the cold. His children grew up in a home where winter was not a time of huddled survival, but a season of stable comfort, a time for mending tools, for reading, for living. The hearth outlived him. When the cabin was finally abandoned, long after he and Sarah were gone, the log walls eventually succumbed to rot and weather. The roof fell in, the floor turned back to earth, but the massive stone core remained, immovable, a monolithic marker on the land. Travelers and hunters would sometimes happen upon the ruins and wonder what giant, strange altar this had been, unaware that it was a machine of survival, a testament to a man who refused to accept a failing tradition. Elias had learned that the most common solution is not always the right one. He had learned that the loudest fire is often the most wasteful, and that true lasting warmth comes from quiet, captured strength. He had looked at the wilderness, not as an enemy to be conquered with a bigger fire, but as a system of forces to be understood. The wind taught him about drafts. The stone taught him about mass, and the cold taught him about efficiency. He had built a structure that did not fight the winter, but rather managed it, storing the brief, fierce energy of the fire to create a lasting peace. He discovered that the difference between catastrophe and comfort is often just a change in design, a willingness to tear down what is wrong, and the courage to build what seems at first entirely ridiculous.